In the first episode of this series, we covered the pilot strategy and the charter, the foundational decisions that determine whether a Cowork pilot is approvable at all. The charter named the scope, the exclusions, the decision rights, and the success criteria. It got signed before anyone touched the admin council. In this episode, we go one layer deeper. The charter points to specific operational documents, the acceptable use policy, the data classification matrix, the documentation of governance posture against the organization's regulatory framework. Those documents are what make the charter enforceable in practice. We'll cover the 4 governance pillars that a Cowork pilot operates against. We'll walk through the components of a pilot phase AUP, which is structurally different from a general AI acceptable use policy. We'll address the data classification matrix and how it maps organizational data categories to permitted Cowork usage. And we'll cover what I'm calling the compliance reality check, what Cowork does and does not currently log, and what that means for any pilot subject to SOC2, HIPAA, GDPR, or equivalent regulatory frameworks. This is the part of the pilot setup that most general guidance skips. It's also the part that determines whether the pilot findings survive review at the end. Cowork governance rests on 4 pillars, and each one requires an explicit pilot phase decision. The pillars are not a checklist. They are the 4 dimensions a complete governance posture has to cover, and a pilot that addresses only 2 or 3 of them will surface gaps in the others as it runs. The 4 pillars are data, action, identity, and observability. The data pillar names what classifications may be processed in Cowork during a pilot, what may not, and what happens at the boundary between approved and excluded. The operational document for the data pillar is the acceptable use policy. Its companion is the data classification matrix. The action pillar names what the agent may do autonomously, what requires explicit confirmation, and what is prohibited regardless of context. Computer use is the highest stakes category in this pillar. Anthropic's own documentation states that computer use is currently a research preview and recommended not to use it for sensitive information at this time. The pilot's posture toward computer use is a deliberate scoping decision, not a default. The identity pillar names who has access to what within Cowork. Custom role-based access controls are an enterprise-tier feature that became available with the April 2026 GA release. The operational document for the identity pillar is the RBAC role assignment matrix. The observability pillar names how the pilot will know what happened. This is where the Enterprise Analytics API, Open Telemetry Export, and group spend limits live. The operational reality of the observability pillar is more complicated than it sounds, and we'll address that complication directly in Section 4. A pilot that has decisions for only some pillars will have to retrofit the others mid-run, and retrofitted governance is rarely defensible at the executive review. The acceptable use policy for the Cowork pilot is the document every participant signs before access is provisioned. It translates the charter's exclusions into specific operational guidance and establishes the conditions under which a participant's access can be revoked. A pilot phase AUP is different from a general organizational AI acceptable use policy. The difference matters because each document is doing different work. A general AI AUP is broad and durable. It applies to all AI tools, all use cases, across an indefinite time horizon. It says things like, employees shall not input regulated data into AI tools, and AI-generated content intended for external distribution requires human review. It's policy. A pilot phase AUP is narrow and time-bound. It applies to Cowork specifically for the duration of the pilot, with explicit references to the pilot's named connectors, applications, and workflow categories. It says things like, during this pilot, the following data classifications are prohibited from being processed in Cowork, and during this pilot, the following applications are out of scope for computer use. It's operational. Both documents matter. The pilot phase AUP does not replace the general policy. It supplements it with the specific operational constraints that apply during the pilot. A workable pilot phase AUP has 6 required components. First, the purpose and scope. The AUP states the pilot it applies to, references the pilot charter by date, and clarifies that it supplements but does not replace the organization's general AI, acceptable use policy, general information security policy, and code of conduct. Second, the prohibited data section. This names, in the organization's own classification taxonomy, the specific data classifications that may not be processed in Cowork during the pilot regardless of workflow. For a healthcare pilot, this typically includes protected health information. For a financial services pilot, this typically includes material non-public information and customer financial account data. For a multi-jurisdictional pilot, this typically includes GDPR-regulated personal data of EU residents. The prohibition is operational, not aspirational. Participants who encounter a workflow that would require excluded data must escalate to the pilot champion before proceeding. Self-redaction by the participant is not an approved substitute for escalation. Third, the Prohibited Applications and Systems section. This names the specific applications and systems that are out of scope for computer use during the pilot. Production Electronic Health Record Systems. Production Customer Relationship Management Tenants. Financial Close and Reporting Platforms. The applications named here are enforced through the Computer Use Allow List configuration, not through trust. Fourth, the Connectors and Plugins section. This names the specific MCP connectors and plugins that are approved for use during the pilot. Participants may not install, request, or connect to any other connector or plugin without written approval from the security owner. This is where the work of the technical setup in Episode 3 actually gets reflected in policy. Fifth, the Computer Use section. This documents which of 3 pilot postures the organization has adopted. Computer use disabled entirely, read-only computer use within a named application allow list, or action-capable computer use within a named allow list. The choice is the result of a deliberate scoping decision in the charter, and the AUP makes the configuration explicit to participants. 6. The escalation procedure and the acknowledgement block. The escalation procedure names the pilot champion as the first point of contact for any uncertain case, and commits the pilot champion to a response within 1 business day. The acknowledgement block is the participant's signature that confirms understanding before access is provisioned. One additional practice worth noting. Participants should be required to review the AUP at provisioning and again at week 4 of the pilot, with re-acknowledgement captured both times. Pilots that surface an unexpected workflow or data category mid-run should pause and amend the AUP rather than continuing under the original language. Amended policies require amended acknowledgement. The data classification matrix is the companion to the AUP. The AUP names the prohibitions. The matrix names the permissions. Together, they translate the Charter's scope language into operationally enforceable categories. Most regulated industry organizations already have a data classification scheme. Some use public, internal, confidential, restricted. Some use PL1 through PL4. Some use numbered tiers or sensitivity labels tied to information rights management. The specific scheme does not matter for pilot governance purposes. What matters is mapping the scheme that already exists onto permitted Cowork usage during the pilot. A typical pilot matrix uses 4 tiers, mapped to specific Cowork permissions. Public data is permitted in all approved workflows. Cowork is appropriate for processing marketing collateral, published research, public regulatory filings, and similar information that the organization has already classified as fit for unrestricted handling. Internal data is permitted in approved workflows with no additional connector restriction beyond the pilot's approved list. Cowork is appropriate for internal communications drafts, internal research summaries, internal meeting preparation, and equivalent. The defining characteristic is that the data is intended for internal organizational handling, but not for external distribution without review. Confidential data is permitted only in workflows with explicit governance owner approval, and with mandatory human review of all outputs before any external distribution. Connectors that would transmit confidential data to external services are not approved for the pilot. This is the operational definition of the yellow zone we'll discuss in Episode 5. Restricted data is prohibited during the pilot phase. This includes regulated client data, material non-public information, personally identifiable information subject to consent restrictions, and equivalent. Restricted data does not enter Cowork in any workflow during the pilot. This is red zone. Protected health information, cardholder data, personally identifiable information subject to GDPR is prohibited during the pilot phase. The rationale is the compliance reality check we'll cover in the next section. Reevaluation of regulated data handling in Cowork requires updated audit and logging capability from Anthropic and the pilot is structured to revisit this at the next phase rather than during the current one. The matrix is built before week 1 and signed off by the governance owner before access provisioning. The mapping work, translating the organization's existing taxonomy into pilot permissions, is the controlled point. Organizations that try to skip the matrix and rely on participant judgment about what is and is not appropriate to process invariably surface governance issues that the matrix would have prevented. One operational note about the matrix: the categories above are illustrative, not normative. Organizations using a different classification scheme should map their own categories onto the permission column, not rename the categories in the template to match their scheme. The work of the mapping is what makes the governance posture defensible at the executive review. The template is a starting frame, not a finished document. This section is the part of pilot governance that most general Cowork content does not address. It's also the part that matters most in regulated industries. The information here reflects Anthropic's own current documentation as of May 2026, and it materially affects what data classifications can be processed in Cowork during the pilot phase. The headline fact is this: Claude Cowork activity is not currently captured in Anthropic's audit logs, compliance API, or data exports. Expanded OpenTelemetry support, part of the GA release on April 9, 2026, provides operational telemetry, and Anthropic's own classification is that OpenTelemetry is operational data, not audit evidence. This distinction matters because it affects every regulated industry framework a pilot might be subject to. For Claude.ai chat and Claude API usage, Anthropic provides standard audit logging through the enterprise tier, the compliance API for individual user actions and conversation content, and data exports. These surfaces support standard SaaS audit patterns and feed enterprise SIM systems. The audit posture for those Claude surfaces is mature. For Cowork specifically, conversation history and file access happens locally on the user's desktop, in the isolated VM that Cowork runs tasks in. Anthropic does not centrally retain this data and therefore cannot expose it through audit logs, the compliance API, or data exports. The Enterprise Analytics API exposes aggregated engagement and adoption metrics for Cowork, but does not expose individual conversation content or file-level actions. Here's what this means for the regulated frameworks most pilots are subject to. SOC 2. Type 2 coverage of Cowork is limited in current form. Auditors require demonstrable controls over data access and processing. The absence of centralized audit logs for Cowork means compensating controls are required to satisfy SOC 2 audit log requirements. OpenTelemetry is operationally useful, but is not a substitute for the audit feed that SIM-based audit trails depend on. HIPAA presents a structural challenge for Cowork. Anthropic offers business associate agreements for qualifying enterprise customers. That's important, and it's available. But the absence of centralized Cowork audit logging means HIPAA Section 164.312b. Audit controls cannot currently be satisfied for protected health information processed through Cowork using Anthropic-side audit data alone. The pilot's operational posture for any healthcare organization is to prohibit PHI from Cowork workloads during the pilot phase, unless the organization has implemented compensating controls that produce defensible audit evidence. GDPR similarly. Anthropic's current guidance advises against using Cowork for regulated workloads pending broader audit coverage. Article 15. Right of access requests cannot be fully serviced from Anthropic-side data for Cowork conversations. The local disk nature of Cowork conversation storage requires endpoint-side controls if GDPR-regulated personal data is processed through Cowork during the pilot. PCI DSS the same. Cardholder data should not be processed in Cowork during the pilot phase. The audit gap is the same as the HIPAA case, and the compensating control overhead typically exceeds the pilot's scope. FedRAMP is straightforward. Claude is not currently FedRAMP authorized. Federal workloads are out of scope for any Cowork pilot at this time. This is not a critique of Cowork. It's a description of where Anthropic is in the product's enterprise audit maturity, and Anthropic has acknowledged this is an area of active development. What it means operationally is that the pilot's exclusion list, the prohibited data section of the AUP, must explicitly cover the regulated categories the framework above identifies. Doing otherwise creates governance exposure that the pilot's findings cannot survive. Organizations that require Cowork audit coverage during the pilot can implement 3 compensating control patterns. Each adds operational overhead, and each provides partial rather than complete coverage. The first pattern is endpoint logging through endpoint detection and response tooling on participant machines. EDR captures process-level activity, including the Cowork process tree, file access events, and network connections. This produces audit quality evidence at significant configuration cost and with the privacy implications of granular endpoint monitoring. The second pattern is a network layer MCP gateway. An MCP gateway mediates all connector traffic between Cowork and external services, providing per-tool authorization policy, audit logging of every connector invocation, and blocking of unattested servers. Third-party MCP gateway products entered the market in early 2026. This is an emerging compensating control category that pilots in highly regulated environments should evaluate. The third pattern, and the most operationally robust for first pilots, is workflow boundary control. Keep regulated data classifications out of Cowork during the pilot. The AUP's prohibited data list and the workflow catalog's red zone are the operational expressions of this pattern. It is the recommended posture for first pilots in regulated environments because it avoids the compensating control overhead entirely and defers the audit coverage problem to a phase when Anthropic's capability has likely matured. Governance documentation for a pilot serves 3 purposes. It establishes the conditions under which the pilot was approved. It guides operational decisions during the pilot. And it provides the evidence base for the go/no-go review at the end. Each purpose requires the documentation to actually exist and to be referenced as the pilot runs. A workable governance documentation set for a pilot includes 6 documents. The pilot charter from Episode 1, signed by the business sponsor, pilot lead, governance owner, security owner, and legal or compliance owner before week 1. The pilot phase acceptable use policy, with the 6 required components addressed and signed by every participant before access provisioning. The data classification matrix, mapping the organization's classification scheme to permitted Cowork usage. The compliance posture documentation, a 1 to 2 page document that addresses each applicable regulatory framework, the framework's specific requirements relative to Cowork's current capability, and the compensating controls or exclusions adopted to address gaps. This is the document that goes to the executive review at the end of the pilot as the answer to how did the pilot operate within our compliance obligations. The workflow catalog with green, yellow, and red classifications, which we'll address in Episode 5. And the governance decision log, a single page maintained by the pilot lead that records every yellow zone resolution decision, every connector or plugin approval that surfaced mid-pilot, and every exception authorization. The log is reviewed at the bi-weekly governance meetings and as part of the documentation set the go/no-go decision references. 6 documents, none of them long, all of them load-bearing. The discipline that matters is keeping the document synchronized with reality as the pilot runs. A pilot that amends the charter at week 3 but does not amend the AUP and the matrix to match has a governance documentation set that the executive review will not be able to interpret. A pilot that resolves a yellow zone case mid-run but does not log the resolution loses the evidence base for the go/no-go decision. This is administrative work, and it's tempting to underinvest in it in favor of the operational work that feels more immediate. The governance review at the end of the pilot is the moment when that investment pays off. Pilots with rigorous documentation discipline produce findings that survive scrutiny. Pilots without it do not. 5 mistakes account for most governance failures in Cowork pilots. Treating the AUP as a checkbox rather than an operational document. Pilots that use template AUP language without adapting it to the organization's specific data classifications, applications, and connectors surface governance issues mid-run that the AUP would have prevented if it had been written for the actual pilot. Assuming Cowork's audit posture matches Claude.ai's. The compliance reality check is a real operational difference. Pilots that bring regulated workloads into Cowork on the assumption that Anthropic's standard audit coverage applies generate exposure they cannot document. Skipping the data classification matrix in favor of participant judgment. Capable professionals can usually tell what's appropriate to process and what isn't, but usually is not the standard the governance review applies. The matrix is the documented evidence that the pilot operated against a defined permission framework. Delegating governance to IT. The four pillars are not technical decisions. Identity has a technical implementation through RBAC, but the policy decision about who gets what permission is a governance question. Pilots that delegate the governance pillars to the team responsible for configuring them produce technical configurations that may not reflect what the organization actually intended to permit, and not building in the documentation cadence. The governance decision log, the AUP re-acknowledgement at week 4, the bi-weekly governance meetings. These are scheduled commitments, not optional administrative items. Pilots that treat them as optional discover at the GOS no-go review that they have weeks of operational decisions with no documented record. A pilot that addresses these 5 mistakes deliberately enters week 1 with a governance posture the organization can defend and a documentation set the executive review can interpret. The governance foundation is what makes the pilot interpretable. The charter establishes the conditions. The AUP, the data classification matrix, and the compliance posture documentation translate those conditions into operational guidance. The compliance reality check ensures the pilot's exclusion list reflects current Cowork capability rather than assumptions about what the platform supports. For a regulated industry pilot, these are not optional documents, and they are not deferred to Phase 2. They are the conditions of approval for the pilot itself. Thanks for watching, and if you're considering a Claude Cowork pilot at your organization, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification icon so you'll know when the next video in this series is released. And if you're ready for a practical place to start, I have several guides, including a newly released Claude Cowork Pilot Playbook, available for purchase. Visit cahillnet.com for guides, bundles, SCORM courses, and more. Until next time.